Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now address other organizational and procedural matters. Let me turn to the program of work for the 47th session. The 47th session will be organized from room 18 until the 2nd of July and in room 20 from the 5th of July onwards. I am very pleased to inform you that the Department of General Assembly and Conference Management and UNOG Division of Conference Management have agreed to service a total of 4 lunchtime meetings on the 8th and 9th and 12th and 13th of July during the period when the Council will be adopting outcomes of the UPR and taking action on draft proposals. As a result of these 4 additional meetings, it is foreseen that we will be able to conclude this session on the 13th of July. Therefore, we have about 3.5 weeks ahead of us, with 7 panel discussions, 25 interactive dialogues with special mandate holders and mechanisms, 6 interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner, and 1 interactive dialogue with a special advisor to the Secretary General. The Council will also adopt outcomes of the Universal Periodic Review. Towards the end of the session, we will proceed with the appointment of special procedure mandate holders. Before proceeding with the adoption of the draft program of work for this session, I would like to recall the discussions of the Bureau at its meetings of the 14th and the 18th of June 2021, in light of the various communications that had been transmitted to me, as well as to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, from the Permanent Mission of the Republic of the Union of Myanmar to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva, and from the Permanent Mission of the Republic of the Union of Myanmar to the United Nations in New York, which had provided conflicting information on the representation of Myanmar at the Human Rights Council, including at the present session. As reflected in the minutes of the Bureau meeting of the 14th of June, the Bureau had recalled that in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 3965 of the 14th of December 1950, whenever more than one authority claims to be the government entitled to represent a member state in the United Nations, and this question becomes the subject of controversy in the United Nations, this question should be considered by the General Assembly. Consequently, the Bureau had noted that pending a decision by the General Assembly on the representation of Myanmar in the Human Rights Council, the Secretariat would not be in a position to process requests regarding the participation of anyone as part of the delegation of Myanmar in Council meetings, including during this 47th session. In light of this situation, the Bureau had agreed, pending the said decision by the General Assembly, to propose for the approval of the Council the postponement of the consideration and adoption of the outcome of the Universal Periodic Review of Myanmar to the 48th session. Further to its meeting on the 14th of June, and in the light of different views that had been expressed by various delegations, further to the issuing of the minutes of that meeting, last Friday on the 18th of June, the Bureau continued its discussions in relation to the representation of the Republic of the Union of Myanmar at this session. Keeping in mind that the modalities for interactive dialogues were the result of long-standing practice, and that long-standing practice had also established that a country concerned with a country-specific report is provided with an opportunity to speak at the beginning of the list of speakers, with additional time given to deliver the remarks, the Bureau had considered the question of holding the presentations of the oral update by the High Commissioner on the overall situation of human rights in Myanmar, and the oral progress report by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Myanmar, and the respective interactive dialogues as mandated by Council Resolution 46/21, when there would be no possibility for the concerned country to comment or to ask questions. Given the importance of the Council hearing the presentations of the oral update by the High Commissioner and the oral progress report by the Special Rapporteur, the Bureau had agreed that the said oral presentations should be held during this session as scheduled. Regarding the related interactive dialogues, given the importance of the matter and underscoring the unprecedented nature of the situation, the Bureau had agreed to seek the views of the states members of the Council at the opening of the 47th session on the question of holding the interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur as mandated in Council Resolution 46/21 and in the absence of the representatives of the concerned country. The Bureau would subsequently revisit the matter and deliberate on the views expressed on the question of holding the said interactive dialogues. In this regard, the Bureau decided that the draft programme of work would be presented to the Council for adoption at the opening of the 47th session, with the understanding that the holding of the interactive dialogues on Myanmar is still subject to further consideration by the Bureau and the Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, against this backdrop, I plan to deal with these matters consecutively and in three parts. I will first deal with the UPR outcome of adoption of Myanmar. Then I will deal with the respective interactive dialogues on Myanmar. And lastly, I will deal with the overall draft programme of work. Let us begin. Firstly, recalling that considering the need for the UPR process to include a high degree of involvement by the state under review before and during the adoption of its UPR report, the Bureau agreed to propose to the Council the postponement of the consideration of the report of the Universal Periodic Review of Myanmar to the 48th session of the Council. I propose to the Council for its approval that the report of the UPR of Myanmar be postponed to the 48th session of the Council. Are there any members of the Council wishing to comment on this proposal to postpone the consideration of the report of the UPR of Myanmar to the 48th session? I see no objection. It is so decided. Secondly, again recalling that the Bureau agreed that given the importance of the Council, hearing the presentations of the oral update by the High Commissioner and the oral progress report by the Special Rapporteur, the Bureau had agreed that the said oral presentations should be held during the session as scheduled. However, in terms of the respective interactive dialogues for the said oral presentations, the Bureau agreed to seek the views of the states members of the Council on the question of holding the interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur. In this regard, I will now proceed with opening up the floor to hear from states members of the Council. Are there any states members of the Council wishing to take the floor to comment on the question of holding the respective interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur during the 47th session? And I recognize the distinguished representative of Austria. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning to all of you. I am delivering this statement on behalf of the EU member states that are members of this Council. The statement has been agreed by the EU as a whole. Madam President, the view of the European Union on the matter at hand is very clear. The interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on human rights situation in Myanmar were mandated by this Council by consensus through HRC Resolution 46/21. It was indeed the Council's unified position that the worsening situation of human rights in Myanmar following the military coup on the 1st of February was of such nature that urgent and continuous scrutiny by this Council would be needed. As you, Madam President, and the Bureau have already pointed out in the minutes of your Bureau meeting, there is no procedural requirement or legal basis which requires the presence of the country concerned during an interactive dialogue on the human rights situation in that country. Interactive dialogues are first and foremost meant to establish a dialogue with and between the members and observers of the Council and to allow them to express their views and ask questions. Madam President, while the EU fully supports the established practice of providing for a country concerned to be present and speak at an interactive dialogue, it would be a bad practice and against the rules of procedure to condition the very holding of an interactive dialogue on the participation of the country concerned. In this case, we are dealing with an accreditation issue, resulting from two competing claims of representation of a country which originated in the overthrow of the elected government of that country through a military coup. Denying the members and observers of the Human Rights Council to debate the human rights situation in that country would not only be without any legal basis, but it would defeat the very purpose of this council. This would not just set a dangerous precedent, but more importantly, it would deprive the HRC of the possibility to interact with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on the situation so grave that it led to the calling of a special session by this council only a few months ago. Furthermore, it is unclear when the General Assembly will resolve this accreditation issue. Will the members and observers of this council be silenced on debating the situation of Myanmar at such a critical moment for all the time it may take the General Assembly to decide on Myanmar's accreditation? Finally, Madam President, we believe that no analogy can be made with the adoption of the UPR report of Myanmar, for which the General Assembly Resolution 60/251 and the IB package provide for the full involvement of the country concerned. The proposed postponement of this agenda item is therefore fully justified. For all the reasons mentioned above, the EU respectfully requests that the interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur in Myanmar on the 6th and 7th of July will remain on the program of work as mandated by the HRC. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, Excellencies and colleagues. It is, of course, unfortunate that the Bureau is unable to recommend a common approach with regard to the participation of certain states in the Council meeting. Now, allow me, Madam President, as requested, to share Indonesia's views on this matter. Now, our point of departure are the principle contained in the UN Resolution 60/251, as well as the Vienna Declaration Program of Action, namely that all states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural system, have the duty to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. Second, the Council should ensure non-selectivity in its work. It is our position that the Council is indeed a forum for dialogue on issues pertaining to all human rights. And in doing so, the Council should be transparent, fair, and impartial while enabling genuine dialogue and being result-oriented. As we have highlighted during the Bureau informal outreach on this matter, consistency is the key in responding to these unprecedented matters. Now, we agree that the development of the situation in Myanmar is unacceptable and must not continue. We would like to reiterate our firm position that the use of force must stop and democracy, stability, and peace in Myanmar must be restored immediately. And the interests of the people of Myanmar will always be a priority, as well as the priority of this Council. In essence, the voice of the people of Myanmar must be heard. Now, indeed, the Council has a difficult task to enable inclusivity so we can contribute a more result-oriented action and impact on the ground. Therefore, the item in the Council program of work must serve its purpose, among others, to present an opportunity for those voices to be heard, whether it's the voice of national human rights institution or the civil society. Now, the involvement of the country concerned is pertinent since it is the duty of the state to promote and protect human rights. We need to listen to the country concerned, and listening to the country concerned will enable the Council to take further concrete action to support them in complying with their human rights obligation for the benefit of human beings. So listening to the country, it will help our work here. But at the same time, it is important also for us, member of the council, to listen right away what's happened on the ground. We need to have our ears and eyes on the ground. And I think the report from the High Commissioner and also from the Special Rapporteur will help us to gain this perspective. Now, I personally believe if we adhere to the principle that I mentioned earlier, will help the council sort of like maintain its unity in this issue. Of course, we will like to hear other views from a delegation before we can agree on such matter. Thank you.
I thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The Philippines believes that country-specific interactive dialogues or sessions must be convened with the participation of the concerned country. Inclusivity is a fundamental principle that guides the work of the Council as an intergovernmental body responsible for strengthening human rights promotion and protection. We note from the minutes of the Bureau meeting that pending a decision by the General Assembly on the representation of Myanmar in the HRC, the Council Secretariat is not in a position to process requests pertaining to this participation. Therefore, we are of the view that holding IDs on Myanmar, absent the concerned country, will not be in keeping with the principle of inclusivity and the essence of dialogue. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. The Kingdom of the Netherlands strongly believes that the interactive dialogues on the human rights situation in Myanmar should remain on the program of work. Both dialogues were mandated by Resolution 4621, which was adopted by consensus by this very Council. We fully support the Council's practice to grant concerned countries the possibility of speaking at the start of an interactive dialogue. However, there is no procedural requirement for the country concerned to participate in such a dialogue. In contrast to the UPR process, which, according to the IB package, should fully involve the country under review, interactive dialogues occur between the Council's members and observers and the High Commissioner or mandate holder. In fact, there have been several instances in which countries concerned did not partake in country-specific debates. The postponement of interactive dialogues as a direct result of an accreditation issue would set a dangerous precedent. It would jeopardize the Council's ability to fulfill its mandated program of work and to respond to human rights situations of concern, the very reason this Council was established. For these reasons, we are of the view that the interactive dialogues should remain on the program of work of this Council session. Thank you very much.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France. You have the floor.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente. La France soutient la position présentée par l'Autriche au nom des pays de l'Union européenne. Il ne serait pas cohérent, en effet, d'organiser un point sur la situation en Birmanie par le Haut-Commissaire aux droits de l'homme et le rapporteur spécial sans entendre les réactions et questions des États et de la société civile au Conseil des droits de l'homme. C'est tout le sens de ces dialogues interactifs. En outre, ce serait même contraire aux règles de procédure et à la résolution 46/21 qui avait été adoptée par consensus. C'est pourquoi la France soutient la tenue du dialogue interactif sur la Birmanie lors de cette session, la 47e session. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Germany fully aligns itself with the EU statement. In Resolution 46/21, the Human Rights Council unanimously condemned in its strongest terms the deposition of the elected civilian government by the Myanmar Armed Forces on 1st February 2021, and expressed grave concern at continuing reports of human rights violations and abuses in Myanmar. In this resolution, the Human Rights Council mandated by consensus 2 interactive dialogues on Myanmar in accordance with its annual program of work. Those interactive dialogues will allow the Council to discuss the situation of violations of human rights. In contrast to the UPR, there is no procedural requirement on the presence of the country concerned in the interactive dialogues. We therefore support the program of work as foreseen, including the 2 interactive dialogues. Thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Благодарим за возможность обсуждения данного вопроса и поиска его решения. Убеждены, что работа Совета должна строиться на принципах инклюзивности, открытости, деполитизации, равноправного и взаимоуважительного диалога и международного сотрудничества. Совет не суд, но площадка, где каждое государство имеет право высказаться. Особенно это касается затрагиваемых государств, ситуация с правами человека в которых проходит обсуждение. Сам формат интерактивного диалога по конкретной стране подразумевает именно диалог, а не обсуждение государства за его спиной. Именно поэтому мы считаем, что каждое затрагиваемое государство должно иметь право высказаться в ходе соответствующего интерактивного диалога. Если же такая возможность отсутствует по объективным причинам, то и дискуссия должна быть отложена до их устранения. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Brazil thanks the Bureau for the information and proposals regarding the controversy over the credentials of Myanmar. Brazil is deeply concerned with the human rights situation in Myanmar. Our position was made clear through votes and statements in this Council and the General Assembly. Our comments today are on matters of principle and procedure. We note that proposals were drafted on the assumption that the participation of the concerned country in the discussions of the Council on country-specific reports is a long-standing practice. Brazil does not agree with that assessment. Beyond being a long-standing practice, the participation of the concerned country relates to a foundational principle of this body. The involvement of concerned countries is part and parcel of any constructive and inclusive dialogue, a fundamental principle of this Council and its methods of work as enshrined in GA Resolution 60/251 and as well as in the IB package. In our view, the HRC as a subsidiary body of the General Assembly should postpone the discussions directly involving Myanmar until the GA reaches a decision on credentials, hopefully sooner than later. It hasn't gone unnoticed that this very Council in March decided to postpone the presentation of some very late reports by a special rapporteur and the specific interactive dialogue for reasons that did not require a higher decision from the Assembly. Brazil is open to any decision that fully respects the principles of the Council and its current status as a subsidiary body of the GA. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. We fully share the view expressed by the European Union and its member states on this matter. The interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar were mandated by this Council by consensus through the HRC Resolution 4621. Based on the Council's unified position, we are convinced that the worsening situation of human rights in Myanmar following the military coup on February 1st is still of such nature urgent and continued scrutiny by this Council is needed. Therefore, for the reasons clearly expressed by the delegation of Austria on behalf of all EU member states, we respectfully request that the interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar on 6 and 7 July will remain in the program of work as mandated by the Human Rights Council. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The delegation of Ukraine fully shares the arguments just presented by Austria on behalf of the European Union and supports the position of the Netherlands, France, Germany, Italy, that the program of work, which includes the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner and Special Rapporteur on Myanmar on 6 and 7 July, should be adopted as it is. Consideration of the human rights situation in Myanmar with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur is an important instrument of the Council disposal, which must not be weakened by any non-existing procedural or legal requirements. We strongly believe that the Human Rights Council was created to address in an efficient manner most serious human rights violations wherever they occur and without any conditions. The interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Myanmar were mandated by a consensus resolution, and their foremost purpose is to provide a platform for discussion between the members and observers of the Council and interaction with the Office of the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on the matter. As it was stated by the speakers before, there is no legal basis to condition holding of an interactive dialogue on the participation of the country concerned. Denying the members and observers of the Council the possibility to have a thorough discussion would undermine the very purpose of the Council, especially in the wake of the reports of an aggravating human rights situation in Myanmar. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My delegation is of the view that current program of work, including interactive dialogues with High Commissioner as well as with Special Rapporteur on Myanmar, should be adopted as it is. As other delegation pointed out, through interactive dialogues, this session were mandated by the Council Resolution 4621, which was adopted by consensus by this Council at the last session. Although it is necessary to hear from the concerned country in the interactive dialogue, it is nonetheless important for the Council to keep discussing the urgent human rights situation. The presence of the concerned country cannot be a condition for holding interactive dialogue, especially given the evolving situation on the ground in Myanmar. This Council should not remain silent until the General Assembly to solve the accreditation issue. We believe the Council should and need to remain vigilant in the times of crisis, thus effectively responding to the urgent human rights situation at issue. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba. You have the floor. I understand that Cuba is not in the room, and we will come back to Cuba. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico. You have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Hemos tomado nota de las dos últimas minutas del Buró sobre la decisión relativa a la participación de los representantes de Myanmar. Compartimos la opinión del Buró sobre el hecho de que ante la falta de una decisión de la Asamblea General sobre la representación de Myanmar, la Secretaría del Consejo no estará en condiciones de tramitar las solicitudes de acreditación. En cuanto a los informes sobre la situación de derechos humanos en Myanmar, que deben presentar la alta comisionada y el relator especial, los cuales fueron solicitados por la resolución 46/21 del Consejo, nos parece importante que dichos informes sean presentados de conformidad con el mandato dado por el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Y agradecemos al Buró por facilitar estas consultas que permitirán conocer la opinión de diferentes delegaciones al respecto. Al mismo tiempo, nos parece importante que la participación del Estado concernido sea garantizada, ya que contribuye al diálogo y a la consideración de situaciones de derechos humanos de manera objetiva, transparente, no selectiva y constructiva. En caso de que el Buró considere apropiado postergar los diálogos interactivos hasta que el Estado concernido pueda participar, mi delegación no tendría objeción. En nuestra opinión, esto no implicaría un impedimento para que el Consejo analice la situación de derechos humanos en Myanmar y, en caso de considerarlo apropiado, adopte una resolución u otra decisión al respecto. Señora Presidenta, reiteramos nuestra confianza en el trabajo del Buró que usted encabeza y esperamos que las consultas que se realicen, tomando en consideración las sugerencias y consejos de la Secretaría, permitan encontrar una solución aceptable para todas las delegaciones. Muchas gracias.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We are grateful to the Bureau and for the proposal to postpone the adoption of the UPR report on Myanmar and today's decision by the Council. We are also grateful to you, Madam President, for seeking our views this morning about how to proceed with the 2 interactive dialogues on Myanmar which are scheduled for this session. It is very clear to the United Kingdom that both of these interactive dialogues should go ahead, as mandated by the Council in HRC Resolution 46/21 just a few months ago. When this Council decides to have debates, it is important that these decisions be followed. We recognise that it's not possible for Myanmar to be represented in this debate. This is unfortunate, but we need to be clear that there is no requirement for the country concerned to take part in an interactive dialogue for it to go ahead. So can I just check you can hear me okay?
Ambassador, we can hear you intermittently, but I think we can carry on. And if we have a difficulty, I will let you know and ask you for a copy of your written statement as well. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. We need to be clear that there is no requirement for the country concerned to take part in an interactive dialogue for it to go ahead. This has already happened on many occasions at the Council. If this is not a requirement, as we have established that it is not, then we should ask ourselves what course of action would be most in line with HRC Resolution 46/21. And it is clear to us that the course of action, which is in line with 46/21, is the holding of the interactive dialogues as scheduled. It would be a significant departure from this Council's resolution in March and the Council's long-established practice to postpone dialogues because the country concerned is not present. We recognise that we are dealing with an unusual set of circumstances that have not arisen before, but we need to be guided by relevant practice of what has happened before as far as possible. And the answer we come to is not a difficult one. We also think that this decision needs to be seen in its proper context. The reason why 2 dialogues were mandated just a few months ago is because there is a human rights crisis in Myanmar. It is so severe that it has been the subject of a special session in February, a consensual Item 4 resolution in March, and will be the subject of a further resolution at this session of the Council. The High Commissioner for Human Rights drew all of our attention to Myanmar once more just over a week ago and warned about the situation there in the strongest possible terms. She gave a chilling warning of the imminent further bloodshed and suffering in Myanmar. A warning that we must all listen to. There can therefore be no doubt at all that the human rights situation in Myanmar warrants discussion in this session, and that it is important for members of this Council and observer delegations to be able to express their views. We'd like to ask all states here today, especially council members, to think quite seriously about what message the postponement of these debates would send. If these dialogues had not been scheduled, we would right now be urging all council members to consider how best to ensure that our deep concerns over the situation in Myanmar could be adequately reflected in this session. The same would apply if these dialogues were to be postponed. We therefore wish to express our strong position that these dialogues should remain in the programme of work. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark. You have the floor.
Madam President, Denmark aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the EU member states that are members of this council, conditioning the holding of an interactive dialogue on the participation of the country concerned would not only be a precedent detrimental to the functioning and purpose of this council, it would also not be compatible with the rules of procedure. Also, we recall that it was this council's consensual decision to mandate the holding of 2 interactive dialogues on Myanmar at this session, in light of the critical situation in Myanmar. Finally, an interactive dialogue is an occasion not only for states to discuss critical human rights situation, it is also an essential opportunity for civil society to engage and ask questions to the High Commissioner and mandate holders. Therefore, Denmark finds it essential that the mandated interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner and the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar remain in the HRC 47 program. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Czech Republic. You have the floor.
Madam President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the Bureau and the Secretariat for providing us with important procedural information. We know the modalities for interactive dialogues have never been codified and that the situation is different in case of UPR adoptions. We have listened carefully to the voices emphasizing the need to hear the country concerned, which we do not dispute. Perhaps we could consider enabling more speaking time to the consent country in future interactive dialogues when the accreditation issue is resolved. However, interactive dialogues take place primarily between those who were given a mandate to do so and the Council. On top of that, introducing a condition for concerned countries to always participate in interactive dialogues in order to hold a dialogue might create a questionable precedent. Should there be any proposal from member states to introduce additional changes to the program of work regarding dialogues, it will be important to hear them clearly. Otherwise, we stand ready to support the program of work as it stands with the UPR adoption being postponed. I thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China. You have the floor.
谢谢主席女士，有关翻译。从各方一样，我们一直在密切关注缅甸局势的发展。我们认为，外部的努力应当有助于缅甸局势的降温，避免局势更加复杂化。中方感谢主席女士刚才介绍的情况，也认真听取了有关国家的发言。我们赞同东盟国家俄罗斯、巴西、墨西哥等国的意见。摆在我们面前的问题，需要以一种透明、非选择性的、公正的态度来处理，把直接当事国排除在外是不公平的，也无助于问题得到深入的讨论。有不少同事建议将有关问题推迟到今年9月下届会议。我们赞同这样的观点。同时，我们也注意到，刚才墨西哥同事也提到了一个解决的思路， 我们希望各方继续进行讨论，也希望主席团在主席的指导下，结合各方的意见，找到一个妥善的解决办法。谢谢主席。
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela. You have the floor.
Gracias, Presidenta. Buenos días a todas y todos. Me complace intervenir en esta primera sesión del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, en primer lugar, para felicitarla y ofrecerle todo el apoyo y desearle todo el éxito en esta nueva sesión de nuestro Consejo. Hemos tomado debida nota de lo expresado por usted y de lo señalado por el Buró. Venezuela se mantiene atenta a la evolución de la situación en Myanmar y hacemos votos porque haya un esclarecimiento pronto que nos permita tomar las acciones respectivas en este Consejo para continuar coadyuvando al respeto de la soberanía de ese país. Consideramos que no es conveniente, señora Presidenta, dar inicio a los diálogos interactivos sobre Myanmar sin la presencia del país concernido, al igual que ya lo han señalado otras delegaciones. Somos en ese sentido de la opinión de que este diálogo interactivo debe ser pospuesto para una nueva oportunidad. No deseamos crear precedentes ni trabajar con un criterio de selectividad en el tratamiento de los casos, por lo que para nosotros posponer esta discusión nos parece la decisión más sensata y agradecemos particularmente a usted, a su liderazgo, por escuchar a las distintas delegaciones de manera tal de emprender una vía de acción que nos permita continuar enalteciendo las normas de nuestro Consejo y evitando crear precedentes que puedan malponer que un diálogo interactivo no se haga con el país concernido, lo cual evitaría justamente el diálogo y la interacción con la nación que está siendo objeto de revisión en nuestro Consejo. Gracias, señora Presidenta. Quedamos a su disposición.
I thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. And we thank your inclusive and open and transparent consultation on this important issue.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think your image is not straight. Perhaps you could just, if you cannot adjust your image. We now have you. Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. Please thank your inclusive, open, and transparent consultation on this very important issue. And we are open to the conclusion of the inclusive dialogue. But our preference is that we should keep the discussions through the two IDs on Myanmar at the current session of the Human Rights Council. And we do believe that we should not lose our eyes on these very important issues and with the voices from the international community. But we count on the very open, inclusive, and transparent consultation with all members. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We voice our interest and position on this issue, and as has been stipulated by the presentations of countries like Russia and China, the fundamental issue is about engagement and cooperation. We understand the situation of human rights in Myanmar is of concern, but the fundamental issue is that discussions taking place in the Human Rights Council should include the country concerned so that the whole proceeding is transparent, inclusive, and in concrete terms also contributes to the overall efforts of the Council in terms of addressing fundamental issues of human rights. Therefore, since the human rights issue is about dialogue and inclusivity and transparency, it's fundamental that the presence of the country concerned in a country-specific resolution and discussion is of utmost importance. In this regard, we feel that until the General Assembly decision is made, that the issue be postponed for discussion in the next session if the country concerned is not participating in the discussion in the 47th session. I thank you.
I thank you. And this was the last speaker on my list. Are there any other delegations who would like the floor? I would like to thank all delegations who have taken the floor. As agreed to by Bureau, the views expressed on the question of holding the interactive dialogues with the High Commissioner and Special Rapporteur will be considered by the Bureau and revisited by this Council. Lastly, again, I would like to recall that the Bureau decided to propose to the Council the adoption of the draft programme of work with the understanding that the holding of the interactive dialogues on Myanmar is still subject to further consideration by the Bureau and the Council. In this regard, I therefore propose, for the consideration and approval by the Council, the draft programme of work with the understanding that the holding of the interactive dialogues on Myanmar is still subject to further consideration by the Bureau and the Council, and with the understanding that the programme of work is an evolving document and that further adjustments may be required according to the progress of our work. Are there any members of the Council wishing to comment on this proposal to approve the draft programme of work with the understanding that the holding of the interactive dialogues on Myanmar is still subject to further consideration by the Bureau and the Council? I see no requests for the floor. Since I see no objection to approving the programme of work, with the understanding that the holding of the two interactive dialogues on Myanmar is still subject to further consideration by the Bureau and the Council, it is so decided. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the online system for inscription on the list of speakers for all interactive dialogues and panel discussions opened last Tuesday, the 15th of June, and closes 24 hours before the meeting in which the respective dialogue or discussion is scheduled to start. Once the online inscription has closed, delegations may still inscribe or withdraw by sending an email to the list of speakers desk. The email address is hrclistofspeakers@ohchr.org. The lists of speakers will close approximately 15 minutes after the beginning of each debate. The online system for inscription on the list of speakers for UPR outcomes adoptions opened this morning at 9 a.m. and will close on Thursday, the 24th of June at 6 p.m. As you know, no inscriptions will be possible after this deadline. For non-government organizations, the list of speakers for all debates taking place during the session opened online on Thursday, the 17th of June at 2 p.m. I would like to reiterate that all participants are requested to upload the Word version of oral statements through the online system for the list of speakers. I would also like to take this opportunity to strongly encourage all of you to respect the speaking time limits for all debates and to exercise self-restraint in the preparation of your statements. Along with the Vice Presidents, I will strive to ensure that meetings begin on time and that speaking time limits be strictly observed by everyone. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to recall that the deadline for the submission of draft proposals to be adopted during the 47th session is set for Friday, the 2nd of July at 1 p.m. An extension of the deadline for the submission of a draft proposal can be approved by the Human Rights Council under exceptional circumstances, one time only, for a maximum of 24 hours. The submission of a proposal after the submission deadline needs prior approval by the Council before it is registered by the Secretariat. I would encourage main sponsors to table their draft proposals as early as possible and not to wait for the deadline. Let me also underline that in accordance with paragraphs 113 and 117 of Resolution 5/1, delegations are invited to conduct open-ended informal consultations to secure the broadest possible support for their initiatives. At least one informal, open-ended consultation should be held on each draft resolution and/or decision before it is considered for action by the Council. In the interest of ensuring the effective participation of all stakeholders in the work of the Human Rights Council, I encourage main sponsors of draft proposals to share draft texts, also with civil society organizations and other observers that follow informal consultations, and to organize virtual informal consultations or conduct rounds of consultations in writing. Let me move to accessibility. With regard to the accessibility of our work, I would like to remind you that there is a focal point for accessibility within the Secretariat, who can be contacted if necessary. I would also like to invite delegations to consider requesting the accessibility of mandated panel discussions to ensure live captioning and sign language interpretation. In addition, delegations are requested to upload their oral statements in Word format so that they can be accessible to persons with disabilities. Please note that speeches uploaded in PDF or other non-accessible format will not be posted on the extranet. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to emphasize that the United Nations, including this Council, has a zero tolerance for any form of harassment, including sexual harassment. In this context, I would like to recall that the Director General has pledged to implement the Code of Conduct, meant to prevent harassment, including sexual harassment at UN events here in Geneva. Moreover, allow me to recall that I have appointed Her Excellency, Ambassador Margarita Rosa da Silva Izata, as gender focal point to assist with its implementation in the Council. Any and all complaints will be dealt with promptly. Let me move on to reprisals. The active participation of representatives of civil society and national human rights institutions in the work of the Human Rights Council is essential to the fulfillment of its mandate. As President of this Council, I can assure you that I will follow up on all allegations of acts of reprisal brought to my attention and intimidation committed against persons in connection to their contribution to the work of the Human Rights Council, its mechanisms, and its procedures. I call on everyone to take all necessary measures to prevent such acts in the first place and to ensure that they are promptly and seriously addressed in case they were to happen. Before we proceed, allow me to draw your attention to some news regarding the video transmission of the session. If you are tuned into this meeting on the UN webcast, you will notice that the page has a different look. This is because a new website was launched this weekend for UN webcast. For those not tuned in yet, the current URL, webtv.un.org, is still active and will redirect you to the new page. The look is quite different, so it may take some time to get used to. However, the new site promises to be more user-friendly and functional and will continue to provide multilingual streaming in 6 languages, as well as video on demand through archiving. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I now declare open Agenda Item 2, entitled Annual Report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and Reports of the Office of the High Commissioner and the Secretary General. This agenda item will remain open throughout the session. Before I invite the High Commissioner to present her annual report, let me remind you that the interactive dialogue on the annual report is scheduled to begin this afternoon. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished President of the Council, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. It is an honor to address this Council on the occasion of its 15th anniversary, sadly a time of grave setbacks in human rights. Extreme poverty, inequalities, and injustice are rising. Democratic and civic space is being eroded. Navigating a clear way out of the complex COVID-19 crisis and towards an inclusive, green, sustainable, and resilient future will be the work of this generation of world leaders or their downfall. The Secretary General's call to action in human rights is a blueprint that connects more closely than ever before the UN pillars of development, peace and security, and human rights. It places support for the full spectrum of all human rights at the heart of every society's capacity to recover from the pandemic emergency, and at the core of the work of all UN bodies and teams. The Secretary General has also outlined the need for a new social contract, underpinned by a new global deal of solidarity which more fairly shares power, resources, and opportunities. In September, he will deliver to the General Assembly a plan for a UN-wide common agenda. These are bold steps that place unprecedented emphasis on the power of human rights to ensure sound and inclusive development, sustainable peace, and societies grounded in trust. I take this opportunity to update the Council on the analysis and work of my office to give effect to these initiatives and to ensure that they work together to deliver strong impact for people around the world. In doing so, I want to emphasize two themes. Firstly, the call to action creates unprecedented leverage to deploy the force of partnerships across the United Nations. I am committed to ensuring that this leads to broader, better integrated, and firmly evidence-based country analysis, unified advocacy, and field-based programming that is better targeted and more effective because of its strong grounding in human rights. Secondly, the call to action underscores the need to approach civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights as a compelling and mutually reinforcing synergy. Economic and social rights and the right to development are universal rights. They are not ordinary services with a market-set price tag, but essential factors in building more peaceful and equal societies. And civil and political rights are equally crucial to building inclusive, participative societies. Together, regardless of the country's wealth or stage of development, steps to uphold these rights create a powerful momentum of public trust. As I pointed out at this Council earlier in my mandate, policies that build social justice also help to develop stronger economies. They drive more inclusive political system. They deepen trust. They build hope. Policies which support the right of every individual to make their own choices advance the 2030 agenda. They are good for communities and nations, space for civil society and independent media to critique and debate promotes transparency and innovation. Systems that deliver justice for victims means that grievances are recognized and make it easier to build or rebuild security and peace. The call to action asks us to advance that vision of the entire United Nations working to uphold all human rights. It will be challenging and absolutely vital. Madam President, I'm convinced that the call to action will be an unprecedentedly powerful human rights mainstreaming instrument, creating momentum and leverage for much stronger human rights integration across the work of the entire UN, particularly at country level. Already in a number of countries, we are seeing better analysis of the impacts of national laws and policies on people facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, including women and girls, more targeted UN programming, and stronger and more unified advocacy with leadership that is empowered to speak out about rights. In Cambodia, for instance, poverty has doubled during the pandemic and now affects an estimated 17.6% of the population. 2 years ago, the poverty rate was 10%. Our human rights staff, in tandem with the entire United Nations systems in Cambodia, have jointly advocated for a well-designed and human rights-based social protection system and the prioritization of healthcare budgets and a broader civic space. A new country team human rights strategy will ensure support for rights-based development and pandemic recovery work. In Serbia, as the pandemic gathered pace, our human rights advisor partnered with UN colleagues, government agencies, and civil society to undertake urgent outreach to the mainly Roma residents of substandard informal settlements across the country. An unprecedented effort to map the most urgent needs ultimately reached more than 700 settlements. It indicated key areas where inadequate access to safe water, electricity, sanitation, and basic income pointed to both long-standing neglect and imminent threat to public health. The exercise, which could only have been achieved with work from the entire country team, led to immediate targeted responses by the authorities with follow-up planning to overcome systemic neglect and social exclusion. In Argentina, the UN country team was quickly mobilized to respond to critical human rights concerns in northeastern Formosa province as the pandemic took hold. The UN resident coordinator led a virtual assessment mission with participation by UNICEF, UNFPA, WHO, PAHO, and OHCHR. He then initiated consultations with the authorities on a potential UN joint strategic program to respond to the health emergency in the province in line with international human rights standards, including tackling a number of structural problems with special focus on indigenous peoples and vulnerable populations. The call to action has been instrumental in unlocking significant shifts. It will be of critical assistance as we work to meet the ambition of the new generation of common country analysis and sustainable development cooperation frameworks. We need to ensure that all UN actors understand who are the most marginalized and why, that we jointly identify human rights setbacks, and that we act together where the UN's collective support can help states to address key human rights challenges, including structural inequalities. Excellencies, our search initiative set up in September 2019 played a key role in upgrading the economic expertise of our field teams at a crucial moment. As the pandemic progressed, we have been able to count on a team of field-facing economists to work with UN economic and development personnel on advice for country recovery strategies and the use of appropriate fiscal policies to maximize the resources available to states. This work very much builds on the targeted expert recommendations issued by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, other treaty bodies, and numerous special procedures mandate holders. In Guinea, for example, this technical and financial support meant our field presence was able to undertake an assessment of the impact of the mining sector on human rights, particularly economic and social rights. Mining is among Guinea's main sources of revenue, and therefore a key potential accelerator for sustainable development and better fulfillment of economic and social rights. But wildcat, or artisanal mining in particular, is associated with serious human rights abuses, including forced displacement and environmental degradation. Our assessment met with strong cooperation from the UN country team in Guinea and very positive work by key government officials, the National Human Rights Institution, and mining companies themselves, as well as affected communities and civil society groups. This has led to ongoing policy reforms, including legislative changes and governance reforms in the mining sector and management of natural resources. Capacity building and work to strengthen legal frameworks are planned, and a joint pilot project on the right to development between OHCHR and the government is also underway. The program in any country can hope to be fully effective if discrimination continues to hold back half the population. Across 10 countries in West and Central Africa, Benin, Central African Republic, Côte d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Guinea, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo, we have partnered with UNICEF and UN Women to set up surveys on the specific impacts of the pandemic on women and girls. This work, which will run through to the end of July, is guided by CEDAW recommendations on collecting accurate age and sex disaggregated data. By addressing the very widespread lack of primary data on gender, it is likely to provide new insights into intersecting forms of discrimination faced by women and may suggest new ways to solve them. It is also in line with the need that has been expressed by a number of governments for support for evidence-based responses to the pandemic. It will also contribute key information to the UN programmatic responses to COVID-19. The call to action provides a key framework for stronger work to address the interlocking impacts of climate change, pollution, and nature loss on rights. Together with UNEP and UNDP, we're leading interagency efforts to advance the human right to a healthy environment by developing UN-wide guidance on protection of environmental human rights defenders, emphasizing participation by children and youth in environmental decision-making, and supporting country teams and national human rights institutions' work in these areas. In the Pacific, our regional office and UNEP have provided capacity-building training for environmental human rights defenders. They're also jointly advocating broader enabling environments that empower human rights network and other agents of positive change. Excellencies, establishing a new social contract is about rebuilding public trust through stronger support for fundamental rights. It is vital to establishing societies in which policymakers place a priority on combating inequalities and promoting rights to social protection, to health, education, and more. Those public investments in the legal commitment made by every state can be underpinned by macroeconomic policies that seek to maximize available resources, including through progressive taxation and curtailing illicit financial flows. A human rights economy requires transparency, accountability, and a broad space for social dialogue, scrutiny, and participation. According to the World Bank, between January and September 2020, more than 200 countries put in place over 1,000 social protection measures involving an average expenditure of $243 per capita. Cash transfer programs alone reach 1.3 billion people, or 17% of the world's population. While it may not always be possible or desirable to sustain exactly the same programs over the longer term, this unprecedented recognition of the role that social protections play in supporting a functioning economy and sustaining society does create a window for realization of the universal right to social protection to reduce exclusion, prevent vulnerability, and strengthen resilience. The evidence is conclusive. Countries that had invested in social protection have been better able to weather the crisis. In Ukraine, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission developed detailed recommendations for the government to remedy weak access to social protections, particularly for the poorest and socially excluded, and liaised with the UN country team to better integrate social protection in COVID response and recovery. A country team-wide policy paper, which was launched at a high-level event in April, aims to contribute to the government's ongoing reforms of the pension system by ensuring a human rights and gender-based approach. Our staff are currently implementing a human rights-based budgeting project that focuses specifically on social protection at the local level in 10 localities. They also contributed to the country team's advocacy with both the IMF and the World Bank regarding measures that could place disproportionate burden on vulnerable people. In Madagascar, with the National Mining Code and related mining taxation processes undergoing revision in Parliament, our human rights advisor produced policy recommendations to raise additional revenues from mining companies to combat extreme poverty and contribute to sustainable development, including of local communities. A number of other proposed measures aim to advance the right of affected community, including mandatory human rights impact assessment when mining permits are requested or renewed. The project's findings have contributed to the Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, which integrated a dedicated pillar on sustainable, inclusive, and resilient management of the environment. Last month, a workshop we organized with ILO, the UN Development Coordination Office, and UN Women look at how we can jointly work to help countries expand their fiscal space in order to scale up social spending. As a former government official, I am very aware that many countries are facing the simultaneous impacts of collapsing global trade, falling remittances, turmoil in commodity prices, and debt burdens. This undermines their ability to deliver on economic and social rights. Reallocating public expenditure using proven technique to combat corruption and illicit financial flows, deploying progressive fiscal policies, and increasing budget transparency, participation, and accountability can assist to free up fiscal space. Again, our internal discussions place emphasis was on practical work in countries and on partnerships across all UN entities to embed human rights assessments and human rights-based approaches into development work. It is essential that the entire UN country team work with the international financial institutions to ensure that they fully uphold human rights in their financing and conditionality. We need the support and advocacy of strong global partnerships in the true spirit of SDG 17. We need to make sure development financing aligns with international norms, addresses discrimination and other root causes of inequality, and integrates both participation and accountability. I appreciate my exchanges with the IMF Director Kristalina Georgieva and the World Bank's President David Malpass, and I look forward to seeing the human rights conviction reflected throughout the operation of their organizations. In Lebanon, our office has worked closely with the country team and national partners to raise concern about the impact of the economic crisis, pandemic, and Beirut port explosion on people's ability to meet basic needs. Skyrocketing prices, including for food, are reaching critical levels, with lives and a fragile social stability hanging in the balance. In cooperation with partners, our field team prepared a UN country team position to the IMF, which proposed reform proposals through a strong human rights lens, insisting of the right and needs of people in situations of vulnerability. Madam President, to recover from the most wide-reaching and severe cascade of human rights setbacks in our lifetimes, we need a life-changing vision and concerted action to follow up. We need a human rights economy, human rights-based development, and societies that in all their diversity share bedrock commitments to reduce inequalities and advance all human rights. We need to anchor our states in the sound foundation of justice, knowing that this effort will build the resilience and deep public trust all governments seek to inspire. The call to action is a collective and substantive endeavor, and support from all states, as well as civil society and other stakeholders, is crucial. Our voices and support for human rights, nationally, regionally, and globally, will be key to the success of this effort. At OHCHR and across many of our partners in the UN's family, work is underway, and with better funding and greater support from member states, we aspire to take it much further. I trust that this Council will also follow through with efforts that can bring to life the vision of the call to action for human rights across the world. Madam President, in my global update to the Council in February this year, I outlined aspects of the human rights situation in Algeria, Brazil, and other countries of the Amazon and Pantanal regions, Cambodia, Chile, China, Comoros, Ecuador, Egypt, Ethiopia, Guinea, Haiti, India, Indonesia, Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Kashmir on both sides of the line of control, Kazakhstan, Laos, PDR, Libya, Malawi, Mali, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict zone, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Tanzania, Thailand, Turkey, Uganda, United States of America, Vietnam, and Yemen, as well as my concerns on action taken against organizations that protect migrant rights in several European countries, notably Hungary and Croatia. In the interactive dialogue, I will be glad to respond to any queries in follow-up to my February statement. In addition, I would like to further update the Council on a few recent issues of significant concern, noting also that the situations in Georgia, Iran, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Ukraine, and Venezuela will be further addressed during this session, and that the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory was recently discussed in a special session. In Afghanistan, I'm alarmed by the sharp increase in violence and civilian harm. The recent attack on a school in a Hazara area of Kabul, which killed 85 children, most of them girls, was especially shocking, even after so many decades of horrific attacks against Afghan families. In the 6 months since talks began between the government and the Taliban, civilian casualties increased by 41% compared to the same period 1 year previously. The withdrawal of international forces, which is expected to be completed by September, is creating fear for the future, particularly among women, minority communities, human rights defenders, and journalists, with deep concern about the risk of losing gains hard-won over the last 20 years. I urge all parties to resume the stalled peace talks and to urgently implement a ceasefire to protect civilians. The independent role of the courageous Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission must be protected. Given the rapid deterioration of the situation, I encourage the Council to increase its monitoring and to consider mechanisms for an effective prevention response. The situation in Belarus also continues to deteriorate, with severe restrictions on civic space, including the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association, raids against civil society and independent media, and the judicial persecution of human rights activists and journalists. We continue to receive numerous allegations of arbitrary arrests and detentions, torture, and ill treatment. Our examination of the situation in Belarus, pursuant to Resolution 46/20, is underway. I regret that, for its part, the government has chosen to discontinue the presence of our senior human rights advisor in Minsk, a position which provided a significant point of engagement and a window for cooperation. In both Chad and Mali, I have been deeply concerned by recent non-democratic and unconstitutional changes in government, which inevitably represent a significant challenge to human rights, and which have weakened the institutional protection of democratic freedoms. However, I know that transitional governments in both countries have affirmed their continued commitments to upholding international legal obligations, including with regard to human rights. I join other international actors in calling for strengthened work to fight impunity, fully participatory and inclusive democratic transition processes, including the holding of free and fair elections, and a swift and full return to constitutional order in both Chad and Mali. Regarding China, it has now been a year since adoption of the National Security Law in Hong Kong SAR, on which my office has expressed serious concern. We have been closely monitoring its application and the chilling impact it has had on the civic and democratic space as well as independent media. Since the 1st of July 2020, 107 people have been arrested under the national security law and 57 have been formally charged, with the first case coming to trial later this week. This will be an important test of independence for Hong Kong's judiciary in its willingness to uphold Hong Kong's obligation under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in accordance with the Basic Law. Separately, I continue to discuss with China modalities for a visit, including meaningful access to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and hope this can be achieved this year, particularly as reports of serious human rights violations continue to emerge. In Colombia, nationwide protests had been ongoing since 28 April against the background of pre-existing economic crisis and deep social inequalities aggravated by the COVID-19 pandemic. My office has expressed deep concern at allegations of serious human rights violation by state security forces. While most demonstration has been peaceful, several instances of violence have been recorded. My office condemns all forms of violence, calls for full respect for the right to peaceful assembly, and encourages dialogue to resolve the crisis. From 28th of April to 16 June, we registered allegations of 56 deaths, including 54 civilians and 2 police officers in the context of the protests, mainly in the city of Cali, as well as 49 alleged victims of sexual violence. My office is also documenting human rights abuses by non-state actors and the effect of sustained roadblocks on human rights. I welcome the President's announcement of a zero-tolerance policy for abuses by security forces and urge the authorities to ensure prompt, effective, and independent investigations into all allegations of human rights violations and abuses committed since the 28th of April, and that those responsible are held accountable. The full implementation of the peace agreement, including support for the historical transitional justice process, remains key in response to the current unrest. Fulfilling these vital promises to the people of Colombia will contribute to addressing root causes and increasing public trust in the authorities. In the Tigray region of Ethiopia, I'm deeply disturbed by continued reports of serious violation of international humanitarian law and gross human rights violation and abuses against civilians by all parties to the conflict, including extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrests and detentions, sexual violence against children as well as adults, and forced displacement. Credible reports indicate that Eritrean soldiers are still operating in Tigray and continue to perpetrate violations of human rights and humanitarian law. The humanitarian situation is dire, with reports of denial of humanitarian access in some localities and looting of aid supplies by soldiers. An estimated 350,000 people are threatened by famine. The investigation we are jointly conducting in Tigray with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is underway, with teams on the ground since the 16th of May. We expect this work to conclude in August, and the findings and recommendations will be made public. In many other parts of Ethiopia, alarming incidents of deadly ethnic and intercommunal violence and displacement are linked to increasing polarization about long-standing grievances. The ongoing deployment of military forces is not a durable solution, and I encourage comprehensive and multidimensional dialogue throughout the country to address the real grievances held. In Haiti, political turmoil continues, linked in part to disagreement about the organization of a referendum on a new constitution and the organization of elections in September. The authorities should guarantee the right to vote under secure conditions. In this context, I am acutely concerned about high levels of insecurity and the government's apparent difficulties in tackling this trend. The police reportedly did not intervene during a number of recent clashes between criminal groups in Port-au-Prince. Such incidents have led to at least 50 deaths, the displacement of more than 10,000 people, and have aggravated already very limited access to basic services. I strongly condemn violent attacks against the Haitian National Police, with the death of 25 police officers since January. I urge the authorities to take all possible efforts to ensure the protection of all Haitians and tackle the root causes of violence. Mexico held its largest ever elections earlier this month amid numerous challenges. I was alarmed by the high level of political violence in the electoral context. At least 91 politicians and members of political parties, among them 36 election candidates, were killed during the electoral period which began in September 2020. There were also a number of other life-threatening attacks and threats against politicians, their supporters, and civil servants engaged in election work. Political parties across the spectrum were affected, and women faced gender-based violence, including sexual violence and smear campaigns. It is vital to ensure accountability for these acts and to guarantee their non-repetition. Moving forward, I'll also encourage authorities to refrain from using language that undermines those expressing dissenting opinion or which in any way puts in question the independence of autonomous bodies, including electoral institutions. And I welcome the recent judgment of the Supreme Court of Mexico accepting urgent action recommendations of the Committee on Enforced Disappearances as legally binding on the authorities. In Mozambique, I am alarmed by the growing conflict in the north, with grave abuses of human rights by armed groups, including the brutal killing of civilians, sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, child abductions, and exploitation. Women and girls are reportedly particularly targeted. I note also reports of serious human rights violations by state security forces supported by private security companies. Almost 800,000 people, including 364,000 children, have been forced to flee their homes by the violence and face growing food insecurity. I am concerned about the lack of effective mechanisms for oversight and accountability. It is important that all alleged violations, whether by private or public actors, be investigated, prosecuted, and that measures be adopted to put an end to such acts. Restrictions on the right to freedom of information, expression, and press freedoms are a serious issue, together with killings and harassment of human rights defenders and discrimination against women and girls. I am encouraged that the President of Mozambique has recently welcomed the opportunity to strengthen our collaboration and engagement and has pledged to address the human rights situation. In the Russian Federation, I am dismayed by recent measures that further undermines people's right to express critical views and their ability to take part in the parliamentary election scheduled in September. Earlier this month, following close hearings, a court in Moscow ruled that the Anti-Corruption Foundation, led by the imprisoned opposition figure Alexei Navalny, was an extremist organization. It also ruled that the Associated Citizens' Rights Protection Foundation and Navalny's nationwide network of political officers are extremists, based on vaguely defined allegations of attempting to change the foundation of constitutional order. Earlier, a law was passed prohibiting people involved in the activities of outlawed extremist organizations from running in any election. I call on Russia to uphold civil and political rights. Legislation restricting the freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association should be brought in line with international human rights norms and standards. I further urge the authorities to end the arbitrary practice of labeling ordinary individuals, journalists, and non-governmental organizations as extremists, foreign agents, or undesirable organizations. In Sri Lanka, I'm concerned by further government measures perceived as targeting Muslims and by the harassment of Tamils, including in the context of commemoration events for those who died at the end of the war. I'm concerned that recent appointments to the Office of Missing Persons and Office for Reparations and steps to discourage investigation into past crimes are further undermining victims' trust. Recent counter-terrorism regulations, which include the listing and or prohibition of more than 300 Tamil and Muslim groups and individuals for alleged support of terrorism, will also not advance reconciliation. Regulations now permit the arbitrary administrative detention of people for up to 2 years without trial for the purposes of de-radicalization. I also note a continued series of deaths in police custody and in the context of police encounters with alleged criminal gangs. A thorough, prompt, and independent investigation should be conducted. We will continue to engage with the government, and I will update the Council further at the September session, including on progress in implementing the new accountability mandate. I'm also pleased to report that we are close to finalizing the UN Joint Program on Human Rights with the government of the Philippines. I note steps taken by the government in its internal review of alleged police killings. It is important that reinvestigation of cases produces meaningful results, as accountability for human rights violations remains a long-standing concern in the Philippines. I again emphasize the importance of protecting and ensuring the full participation of civil society and independent national human rights institutions. I will update the Council further on this situation in September. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, Madam High Commissioner. As I said earlier, the interactive dialogue with High Commissioner on the presentation of the report just presented will begin later this afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the interactive dialogue on the report of the High Commissioner on the central role of the state in responding to pandemics and other health emergencies and the socio-economic consequences thereof in advancing sustainable development and the realization of all human rights, pursuant to Council Resolution 42/2. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Madam High Commissioner for her presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Excellencies, colleagues, over a year now, billions of people in the planet had their lives turned upside down virtually at the same time. If at the onset of the pandemic we could barely comprehend the full extent of the crisis, the strangeness now is to recall a time when mask variants and physical distancing were not at the top of everyone's minds. The loss and distress has been immense. As of last week, there has been over 176 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 reported globally to the World Health Organization, with over 3 million deaths. The pandemic continues to pose an extraordinary threat to societies worldwide, both as a public health emergency and a socio-economic crisis with far-reaching consequences. Given the severity and complexity of the challenge, the Human Rights Council, pursuant to Resolution 44/2, has requested my office to prepare this report that I'm honored to present today. Colleagues, the report highlights that the central role of the state during pandemics and other health emergency is to mount a robust health response while upholding human rights. It also stresses that the resilience of health systems and national economies have been undermined to a great extent by the failure to adequately invest in meeting human rights obligations. To honor their commitment made under human rights laws and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, states should step up investment in health and social protection systems backed by multilateral, joined-up approaches based on solidarity. These steps require renewed political will and leadership. COVID-19 has shown that the failure to integrate human rights-based approaches into health emergency preparedness, response, and recovery efforts has serious consequences for human rights and development. In addition to the incalculable loss in human lives, the economic cost of the pandemic has been catastrophic. Around 255 million jobs are estimated to have been lost during 2020, nearly 4 times the figure of the global economic crisis in 2008. Women have been more severely affected than men in all regions and all income groups. The estimate is that the pandemic may have pushed up to 150 million people into extreme poverty by the beginning of 2021. Global hunger is also on the rise. Over 130 million people have become more vulnerable to undernourishment last year. Informal sector workers, most of whom are women, have been particularly hit hard. In some regions, they could have lost up to 81% of their income in the first month of the crisis. Groups that have been long marginalized by systemic discrimination and pervasive inequalities have been affected the most. The impact on women and girls, older people, people with disabilities, LGBTI, Q+, people deprived of liberty, among other groups, has been particularly severe. Overall, the pandemic has either disrupted or reversed hard-won progress on achieving many of the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of health, this crisis has also had a catastrophic effect on other services. There have been serious disruptions to the provision of sexual and reproductive health services and treatments for non-communicable diseases, as well as mental health care and routine vaccination. States should ensure continued availability and accessibility of care, medicines, and vaccines, protecting the primacy of public health over private profit. And as I have said before, vaccines against COVID-19 must be considered as a global public good. The universal and equitable access and distribution of vaccines is likely the strongest determinant of whether and how soon we can control the pandemic. If radical steps are not taken to protect economic, social, and cultural rights and support low-income countries, the outlook remains bleak. This involves respecting, protecting, and fulfilling economic, social, and cultural rights, prioritizing universal health coverage and universal social protection. But after emergency spending to address the impact of the pandemic, instead of focusing on long-term investment to build resilience, many countries are likely to reduce their budgets. It is concerning that a wave of new austerity is likely to affect around 85% of the global population by next year. Many low-income countries already in debt to distress face severe fiscal limitations to respond effectively to the pandemic and its impacts. Consequently, many developing countries are trapped in a dilemma between a debt crisis and a development and human rights crisis. Although most states are making genuine efforts to minimize the socio-economic impact of the crisis, critical gaps remain. Perhaps most egregious is the exclusion of women from COVID-19 related policymaking and decision-making, which has led to policies that generally fail to adequately address the gender, social, and economic consequences of the pandemic. Participation is a right to all, but it's more than that. Both my personal experience and the lessons of history have me convinced that meaningful participation is the only way out of crises of this magnitude, and the only path to long-lasting transformative change. Civil and political rights, such as the right to participate in public affairs, freedom of expression, and freedom of association, must also be upheld. Emergency measures that may result in restrictions on human rights must be time-bound and meet the requirements of non-discrimination, legality, necessity, and proportionality. Distinguished delegates, my report outlines several different measures that state and other stakeholders can take to integrate a human rights-based approach into health, emergency preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. Stimulus packages, for example, should be developed and assessed through a human rights lens. Proposed fiscal and economic reform should be gender transformative, address pre-existing inequalities, and avoid creating new ones. In other words, what we need is a human rights economy, an economy that upholds the dignity and rights of all and promotes sustainable development that leaves no one behind. States need to step up investment in health and social protection systems for the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights by using the maximum of their available resources. That includes through progressive taxation, the efficient and equitable allocation of resources, combating corruption, and international cooperation. Laws and policies that discriminate against women and marginalized populations and groups need to be repealed, rescinded, or amended. And we need to shape policies based on disaggregated data that identifies those who are specifically being excluded or marginalized, helping us determine the root causes of inequality and discrimination. Other areas that need attention include climate change and the environment, business and human rights, and international and unilateral sanctions. Dear friends, last year, Secretary General called for a new social contract, a new global deal to combat inequality and recover better from the pandemic. To transform this vision into reality, we need people and their rights to be at the center of recovery efforts and policies. This will be our path to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. More than an assessment of the multiple impacts of the pandemic and the needs generated by it, my report offers concrete recommendations on how to recover better with human rights-based recovery efforts. In that sense, it is also a guide to ensure we are more resilient and better prepared for potential future health emergency. My office and I look forward to continuing our work to support states in this regard. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank you. Please be advised that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the High Commissioner and to make comments on her report. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Paraguay on behalf of a group of countries. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Presidenta. Es un honor realizar esta intervención en nombre de Argentina, Brasil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, México, Panamá, Perú, Uruguay y mi país, el Paraguay. Expresamos nuestra profunda tristeza por las más de 3 millones de muertes en el mundo a causa de la COVID-19. Coincidimos con usted en que el mundo no solo está sufriendo la pandemia de la COVID-19, sino también de una preocupante profundización de las desigualdades sociales y económicas preexistentes, lo que demuestra la urgencia de una perspectiva integral de los derechos humanos. Las vacunas se han convertido en la nueva frontera en el camino hacia la igualdad. Su informe es claro. La brecha entre los países sigue siendo tan grande como siempre. Unos pocos estados han recibido más del 87% de las dosis y los países en desarrollo solo el 0,2%. Esta falta de equidad en el acceso a las vacunas nos aleja de las metas fijadas por los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. La carga de las adversidades no se ha distribuido de forma equitativa entre países y tampoco entre las poblaciones. Los grupos que ya sufrían por la pobreza, la marginación y múltiples e interseccionales formas de discriminación han sido principalmente afectados, así como los países en desarrollo, inclusive en nuestra región. El derecho a gozar de los beneficios del progreso científico y sus aplicaciones se han socavado. Llamamos a sumar esfuerzos para facilitar la producción local de medicamentos y la transferencia de tecnologías de la salud con el objetivo de hacerlas más accesibles para todos y permitir que a través del acceso al derecho a la salud otros derechos sean garantizados. Muchas gracias, Presidenta.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to Estonia on behalf of a group of countries by video statement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Estonia. We thank the High Commissioner for her report on state responses to pandemics that once again very clearly manifests the need to step up our efforts in ensuring human rights for all. We are concerned to see that despite the many calls to remain vigilant and not allow responding to the pandemic at the price of weakening democracy, the respect of rule of law and human rights, the pandemic has been used as a pretext by some for shrinking democratic and civil society space. Disproportionate measures to fight the pandemic have hit hard against many societies and especially those in vulnerable circumstances, including women and children. It is worrying that the attacks on media freedom and independence of the judiciary have been on rise, leading governments to act without almost no oversight and no opportunity to hold them to account. This crisis is still far from over. We therefore need to learn our lessons and to ensure that human rights are at the center of our actions. We fully support the High Commissioner's call to ensure accountability for human rights violations and abuses, including sexual and gender-based violence, and access to effective gender-transformative judicial and other remedies. The Nordic and Baltic countries believe that to build back better, we need a transformative change, with the key words being empowerment, participation, and democracy. Crisis should never be used as an excuse for undue restrictions on democracy or violations of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Cameroon on behalf of the group of African states. You have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. J'ai l'honneur de cette intervention au nom du groupe africain. Le groupe africain tient à remercier le haut-commissaire pour cet important rapport. Malheureusement, nous constatons une grande inquiétude que l'inégalité a atteint des proportions de crise dans le monde entier, ce qui constitue une menace croissante pour notre avenir collectif dans la promotion et la protection de tous les droits de l'homme. La pandémie COVID-19 met en lumière cette injustice qui touche de manière disproportionnée les personnes en situation de vulnérabilité, notamment les femmes et les enfants. Le groupe africain partage le sentiment exprimé par la haut-commissaire selon lequel les États doivent augmenter les investissements dans les systèmes de santé et de protection sociale en s'appuyant sur des approches multilatérales, conjointes et solidaires. Ces mesures requièrent une volonté politique et un leadership renouvelé pour honorer les engagements pris par les États en vertu des droits de l'homme et des droits humanitaires, ainsi que de l'agenda 2030 pour le développement durable et les moyens de mise en œuvre nécessaires, aujourd'hui plus que jamais nécessaires. Madame la Présidente, la pandémie Covid a commencé comme une urgence de santé publique qui a entraîné des conséquences socio-économiques et de grave envergure pour tous les États, avec une disproportionnalité dans les États en développement. Les États ont fait de réels efforts pour minimiser l'impact socio-économique de la crise, mais des lacunes critiques subsistent en raison de l'espace fiscal limité. Il est essentiel d'envisager un allègement et une remise de la dette pour aider les pays à faire face à l'impact COVID-19. La baisse des recettes publiques contrarie les efforts déployés pour répondre de manière adéquate à la pandémie. L'allègement de la dette aidera les pays africains à canaliser une plus grande partie de leurs ressources financières limitées vers une réponse d'urgence vitale à la COVID-19 et à investir dans le renforcement des systèmes de santé afin de prévenir de futures pandémies et de préserver la vie et les moyens de subsistance de millions de personnes parmi les plus vulnérables. Comme l'indique également le rapport, l'allègement de la dette devrait être étendu à tous les pays dans le besoin, afin de fournir aux pays en développement l'espace fiscal nécessaire pour atténuer les conséquences socio-économiques. Enfin, Madame la Présidente, le nationalisme en matière de vaccins, qui consiste pour les pays à donner la priorité à leurs propres besoins en vaccins, devrait handicaper non seulement la reprise sanitaire mondiale, mais aussi la reprise économique. Le groupe africain a toujours plaidé en faveur d'une distribution juste et équitable des vaccins en tant que bien public et veillant à ce que personne ne soit laissé pour compte et que les plus démunis soient les premiers à être atteints. Le groupe africain promeut le multilatéralisme, la solidarité mondiale et la coopération internationale.
I thank you. I'm so sorry, Your Excellency, but your time is up. Could I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius on behalf of a group of countries? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. I deliver this statement on behalf of a group of SIDS, the full list of which will be posted on the HRC extranet. We thank High Commissioner Bachelet for her oral update on the issue. Madam High Commissioner, not only have we drifted away from achieving SDG 3, but the pandemic has affected every aspect of life beyond health sector. Those working in tourism, a vital sector of SIDS, have been hardly hit. Nevertheless, the proactive decisions by the SIDS in closing borders in various economic sectors have prevented the worst outcomes. Most of us, part of the COVAX facility, have begun vaccinating our people. However, according to UN data, less than 10% of the global SIDS population has received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. It is against this backdrop that we welcome all initiatives that aim to make vaccines a global good that is accessible and affordable to all. We will continue to work with international institutions and regional and bilateral partners to ensure equitable access to vaccines, especially the most vulnerable. Madam High Commissioner, given our inherent vulnerabilities, there is an urgent need to ensure momentum on climate action and address the impact of climate change, SIDS being the most vulnerable. We will continue to play an active role on the international arena, as well as this Council, to keep mitigation and adaptation of climate change as a top priority as we drive down the road to recovery from COVID-19. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Madam High Commissioner.
I thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt on behalf of the group of Arab states by video statement. The floor is yours.
رئيسة، يشرفنا نلقي هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية. تحمل الدول المسؤولية الأساسية في حماية المتواجدين على أراضيها من آثار أي جائحة وتمكينهم من الحصول على الرعاية الصحية وكذا اتخاذ الإجراءات الاحترازية اللازمة مع الالتزام في ذات الوقت بحماية كافة الحقوق عند تطبيق أي تدابير استثنائية. وقد كشفت جائحة الكورونا أنه لا يمكن مواجهة حالات الطوارئ والأوبئة العالمية أو الحد من آثارها المختلفة وصولا لتحقيق التعافي دون تبني مقاربة شاملة قائمة على التعاون والتضامن الدولي ومشاركة مختلف أصحاب المصلحة، فمن الصعب تخيل تحقيق النتائج المرجوة دون ضمان النفاذ العادل والشامل للقاحات. ونشير هنا إلى الشواغل المشروعة التي أبرزها أمين عام الأمم المتحدة بشأن استحالة السيطرة على هذا الوباء.
I'm sorry, could I ask the Secretariat please to pause that video? We're not getting very good sound, nor are we getting interpretation. And can I ask that this video be played a little later when we can improve the sound? And when it is played, it should be played from the beginning, please. Thank you. I now give the floor to Azerbaijan on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement. The full statement will be uploaded to the extranet. NAM is deeply concerned about negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the enjoyment of human rights around the world, and the pandemic has exposed and aggravated vulnerabilities and inequalities in both developing and developed countries, deepening poverty and exclusion and pushing the most vulnerable even further behind. We stress the urgent need to ensure the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and to facilitate development of robust health systems and universal health coverage. NAM expresses serious concern over the disparity in distribution of vaccines against COVID-19 between developing and developed countries, which prevent the entire international community to achieve the elimination of the pandemic as soon as possible. We call for equitable, affordable, and fair access to and availability and distribution of vaccines between developing and developed countries. We also welcome the adoption by consensus by this Council at its 46th session of the resolution on ensuring equitable access for all countries to vaccines upon the initiative of Ecuador and Azerbaijan on behalf of NAM. NAM recognizes that it's a coordinated, concerted global response based on unity, multilateral cooperation, solidarity, and respect for human rights that the international community can craft strategies to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 and recover from the pandemic. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the European Union for a video statement.
Madam President, the EU thanks the UN High Commissioner for presenting her report on the central role of the state in responding to pandemics. COVID-19 not only impacts the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights, but also civil and political rights. Sustainable development is only possible if fundamental human rights principles such as non-discrimination and the rule of law are respected. Effective and efficient governance institutions need to be responsive to public needs and promote inclusive growth. Inclusive political processes are key to ensure that citizens can hold public officials to account at all levels. In this context, we would like to stress the need for government action to be necessary, proportionate and non-discriminatory, in accordance with international human rights law. It is also important to include multilateral institutions, civil society and the private sector in all relevant processes. Madam High Commissioner, in your report you are stressing the importance of upholding civil and political rights, such as the rights to participate in public affairs, freedom of expression and freedom of association. Can you please elaborate more in this context on what states and international community can do to improve the current situation? I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Indonesia on behalf of ASEAN for a video statement.
And I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of ASEAN. 1 year after the global spread of COVID-19, challenges in responding to the pandemic and its multidimensional impact, including on human rights, continue to exist. ASEAN member states have rallied and worked to address the pandemic in a holistic, comprehensive, inclusive, and practical manner. To uphold the right to health, ASEAN worked to ensure equitable access to vaccine, medicine, and medical device, including through cooperation and technical assistance with various partners. Learning from previous regional crises, ASEAN has strengthened its resilience and preparedness by developing special instruments like the COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund to procure vaccine, ASEAN Regional Reserve for medical supply, ASEAN Strategic Framework for Public Health Emergency, ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework. To support national economic recovery, ASEAN adopted the Comprehensive Recovery Framework, setting broad strategies and identifying recovery measures in line with sectoral and regional priorities. Inclusivity is one of the guiding principles for this framework, taking into account the vulnerable groups and sectors that hardest affected by the pandemic. Only by working together to support national effort, intensify regional and multilateral cooperation, we can further fulfill the right to health and address inequality. ASEAN will do its part to continue promote and protect human rights in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of a group of countries by video statement.
Nous remercions la haute commissaire pour son rapport sur le rôle de l'État dans la réponse aux pandémies. La famille est une valeur sociale, culturelle, morale, religieuse incontestable qui devait être célébrée et entretenue. Conformément au droit international des droits de l'homme, en particulier à la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et aux 2 pactes internationaux, la famille est l'élément naturel et fondamental de la société et en tant que tel a droit à la protection de la société et de l'État. Malgré les défis auxquels la
Yes, again, I'm going to have to ask the Secretary to pause this video, please, and we will play it later. Perhaps the representative of Côte d'Ivoire could send a written statement of the statement on the video, so this will assist the interpreters. And the same applies to the statement by Egypt on behalf of the group of Arab states. I now give the floor to Denmark on behalf of a group of countries.
Madam President, I'm pleased to speak on behalf of a cross-regional group of 36 states. COVID-19 is one of the greatest challenges in the history of the UN. We mourn the loss of life and are deeply concerned about the loss of livelihood and the negative impact on the enjoyment of human rights, hampering progress on the 2030 agenda. The pandemic exacerbates inequalities, and those most at risk are persons in vulnerable situations. We are concerned about the use of the pandemic as a pretext for violating human rights and fundamental freedoms. We express our determination to build back better with respect for human rights at the heart. We firmly believe that preparedness, response, and recovery strategies that respect human rights result in more just and sustainable outcomes. To that end, we have made a sustainable recovery pledge. The pledge will be launched at a high-level event on the 30th of June and is on the extranet as part of this statement. We invite all states that have not already done so to join the pledge, and we invite non-state actors to support it. I thank you.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to China on behalf of a group of countries by video statement.
President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of a group of countries. The full text of this statement will be uploaded to the lectionary. The COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted severe negative impacts on economic and social development in all countries, especially in developing countries. Vaccines are powerful tools to address the pandemic, and thus should become a global public good. However, the access, availability, and affordability of vaccine has become a severe problem. We are worried by the disturbing trend of vaccine nationalism and stockpiling of vaccine doses far above the need of their populations. We support the call of the United Nations for fair and equitable distribution of COVID vaccine globally, and urge all countries in the spirit of solidarity and international cooperation to improve the accessibility.
So sorry, but again, we're not getting interpretation because I think the quality of the video sound is very, very poor. Again, I'm going to have to ask to stop the video, and we will try and play it later when we can adjust the sound. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait for a video statement.
سيدة الرئيسة، نتقدم بخالص شكر السيدة المفوضية السامية المفوضة السامية لحقوق الإنسان على ما ورد في التقرير المقدم للدورة بشأن الدور المحوري للدولة في الاستجابة والتصدي للجوائح وغيرها من حالات الطوارئ ونشاطرها القلق حيال العواقب المترتبة لهذه الأوبئة على أعمال جميع حقوق الإنسان في كافة البلدان. سيدة الرئيسة، إن دولة الكويت منطلقة من هويتها العربية والإسلامية وسياستها القائمة على مبادئ التضامن الدولي كانت في طليعة الدول الداعمة للمنظومة الأممية في مواجهة الجائحة، فقد حرصت على التعاون مع العديد من الشركاء وساهمت بشكل فعال في عدد من المبادرات الهامة لتنسيق الجهد الدولي لمواجهة الجائحة. ففي الوقت الذي كانت فيه بلادي تسابق الزمن من أجل التصدي لهذه الجائحة داخليا، لم تتردد في أن تكون من أوائل المستجيبين لنداء الأمم المتحدة وآلياتها من أجل مكافحة جائحة كورونا، فحرصت على تعزيز التعاون الدولي لتمكين منظمة الصحة العالمية والشركاء الصحيين من مواجهة الوباء ومن إنقاذ الأرواح ولا سيما الفئات الأكثر ضعفا، وحرصا على دعم كافة الجهود لضمان توفير اللقاح بشكل عادل وسريع وآمن لكافة الدول. وبناء على توجيهات حضرة صاحب السمو الأمير، أعلنت دولة الكويت مؤخرا تعهدا لدعم تحالف كافي ومنظومة كوفاكس بمبلغ 40 مليون دولار. سيدة الرئيسة، إننا نتفق مع ما ورد في تقرير السيدة المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان من أن المسؤولية الأولى تقع على عاتق كل دولة لتوفير كافة المرافق والموارد اللازمة لبلوغ المستوى المأمول من الرعاية الصحية لمواطنيها. إلا أننا نؤكد أيضا على مسؤولية النظام الدولي الذي يجب أن يظهر درجة من التكافل والتعاضد في مواجهة هذه الجائحة.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the United Arab Emirates on Zoom. UAE, you have the floor. I see that UAE is in the room. You have the floor. We will come back to the UAE. I now give the floor to Qatar for a video statement.
الرئيسة، نشكر المفوضة السامية على تقريرها ونتفق مع ما ورد فيه من أن جائحة كوفيد-19 تشكل تهديدا غير مسبوق للدول والمجتمعات، وأن عواقبها لا سيما الاقتصادية والاجتماعية ستؤثر على مسار التقدم الحاصل نحو تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة وعلى حماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان. وعليه نؤكد على أهمية اتباع نهج تعاوني دولي مشترك لضمان تحقيق استجابة منسقة وفعالة للحد من الآثار السلبية التي فرضتها جائحة كورونا، وضمان حصول الجميع على اللقاحات بشكل آمن وعاجل ومنصف. لقد حرصت دولة قطر منذ بداية انتشار الجائحة على تقديم كافة الخدمات الصحية والتطعيمات لجميع المواطنين والمقيمين فيها، وكان موضوع حماية واحترام حقوق الإنسان أساساً للتدابير التي تم اتخاذها للوقاية والمواجهة تداعيات هذه الجائحة. كما قدمت الدولة الدعم اللازم للحد من التأثير السلبي لا سيما الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، وتم اتخاذ العديد من التدابير لضمان الحماية الكاملة للعمالة الوافدة وضمان حصولهم على جميع حقوقهم. أما على المستوى الدولي قدمت دولة قطر مساعدات طبية إلى حوالي 88
I understand the interpreter cannot hear the video.
المساعدات الحكومية وغير الحكومية ما يفوق 256 مليون دولار أمريكي. كما دعمت برنامج تطوير وتوفير اللقاحات، وتم تخصيص جزء كبير من المساعدات الإنمائية للبلدان النامية والأقل نمواً.
I understand the sound is back. Could we continue to play the video?
قدمت دولة قطر مساعدات طبية إلى حوالي 88 دولة، وبلغ إجمالي المساعدات الحكومية وغير الحكومية ما يفوق 256 مليون دولار أمريكي. كما دعمت برنامج تطوير وتوفير اللقاحات، وتم تخصيص جزء كبير من المساعدات الإنمائية للبلدان النامية والأقل نمواً.
Thank you, and I understand that that was the end of the video. I understand also that we can now play the videos that we were unable to play previously. I now give the floor to Egypt. Egypt, we can now play the video. Egypt, on behalf of the group of Arab states.
يشرفنا نلقي هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية. تحمل الدول المسؤولية الأساسية في حماية المتواجدين على أراضيها من آثار أي جائحة، وتمكينهم من الحصول على الرعاية الصحية، وكذا اتخاذ الإجراءات الاحترازية اللازمة مع الالتزام في ذات الوقت بحماية كافة الحقوق عند تطبيق أي تدابير استثنائية. وقد كشفت جائحة الكورونا أنه لا يمكن مواجهة حالات الطوارئ والأوبئة العالمية أو الحد من آثارها المختلفة وصولا لتحقيق التعافي دون تبني مقاربة شاملة قائمة على التعاون والتضامن الدولي ومشاركة مختلف أصحاب المصلحة. فمن الصعب تخيل تحقيق النتائج المرجوة دون ضمان النفاذ العادل والشامل للقاحات. ونشير هنا إلى الشواغل المشروعة التي أبرزها أمين عام الأمم المتحدة بشأن استحالة السيطرة على هذا الوباء دون تحقيق المناعة الجماعية بتحصين الجميع حول العالم. وإنه لمن المؤسف استمرار احتفاظ بعض الدول بأعداد كبيرة من اللقاح بصورة تتجاوز احتياجاتهم، في حين لم تتمكن غالبية دول العالم سوى من تطعيم نسبة ضئيلة من مواطنيها. وتؤكد المجموعة العربية على أهمية تعزيز التعاون الدولي بما يسمح بتحقيق التعافي من الوباء وتداعياته الصحية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية، وبما يصب في صالح تعزيز حقوق الإنسان حول العالم. شكرا.
Thank you. And we will now again play the video by China on behalf of a group of countries.
President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of a group of countries. The full text of this statement will be uploaded to the lectionary. The COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted severe negative impacts on economic and social development in all countries, especially in developing countries. Vaccines are powerful tools to address.
Yes, I apologize. I apologize to the distinguished representative of China, but I think the quality of the sound here in this room is very poor and the interpreters are unable to interpret. We will try to play the video again shortly as soon as we have tried to fix the sound. I understand that Côte d'Ivoire is going to participate on Zoom. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire. I'm afraid we are unable to locate Côte d'Ivoire on the screen in the Zoom platform, and we will now move on to Cuba for a video statement.
Agradecemos la presentación del informe. Hubiera sido pertinente que el mismo profundizara en el efecto de las criminales e injustificadas medidas coercitivas unilaterales en la respuesta a pandemias. En nuestro caso, el bloqueo de Estados Unidos, recrudecido a niveles extremos, ha exigido de Cuba mayores esfuerzos que cualquier otra nación para contener los efectos de la pandemia. Nuestro sistema de salud, universal y gratuito a todos los niveles, ha garantizado la capacidad asistencial, científica y humana para responder a la COVID-19 en medio de fuertes dificultades materiales y financieras. La aplicación de un plan nacional ha permitido la recuperación del 94% de los contagiados, lo cual nos sitúa entre las naciones de mejor resultado en este indicador. Hemos desarrollado 5 candidatos vacunales, 2 de ellos en fase avanzada de ensayo clínico. Los resultados son muy alentadores. En días recientes iniciamos una intervención sanitaria en grupos y territorios de riesgo. Comenzó también un ensayo clínico para edades pediátricas. Antes de la próxima sesión del Consejo, el 70% de los cubanos debe estar inmunizado con vacunas cubanas. Fieles a nuestro compromiso con la solidaridad internacional, hemos apoyado con personal médico a otras naciones en el enfrentamiento a la pandemia. Ratificamos que la cooperación y la solidaridad nunca serán para Cuba palabras vacías, sino el camino para enfrentar con éxito los complejos retos que la especie humana tiene por delante. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Switzerland for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente, la Suisse remercie la Haute Commissaire pour la présentation de son rapport qui recense de manière compréhensive les diverses conséquences de la pandémie de la COVID-19 sur les droits de l'homme et formule des recommandations clés pour les États. Ce rapport contribue ainsi à réaffirmer l'interdépendance des droits de l'homme, tout comme la nécessité d'une approche fondée sur les droits de l'homme dans le contexte des situations d'urgence sanitaire. À l'instar de la Haute Commissaire, la Suisse est notamment préoccupée par les attaques contre la liberté de la presse et l'indépendance de la justice, ainsi que les restrictions en droit à la liberté d'expression et de réunion pacifique sous le prétexte de la lutte contre la pandémie. Nous rappelons que toute restriction aux droits de l'homme doit être nécessaire, proportionnée et non discriminatoire, avoir un objectif et une durée précise et être conforme aux obligations internationales de l'État. Madame la Haute-Commissaire, la Suisse est préoccupée par les effets disproportionnés que la pandémie a sur les femmes et les filles, ainsi que sur les personnes et groupes en situation de vulnérabilité, tant au niveau épidémiologique et économique et social. Comment pouvons-nous assurer que ces personnes soient mieux protégées contre les futures crises et que les inégalités préexistantes ne soient pas davantage creusées? Je vous remercie.
Thank you, and I now give the floor to Ecuador on Zoom.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. El Ecuador agradece el informe presentado, acoge sus recomendaciones y coincide en la necesidad de integrar enfoques basados en derechos humanos a los esfuerzos de preparación, respuesta y recuperación ante emergencias sanitarias.
I apologize to the distinguished representative of Ecuador. We just can't hear you, and nor can the interpreters. Can we come back to you, please, when we've tried to resolve this problem? I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany by video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns with the EU. We are very concerned about the backsliding human rights situation in several countries during the pandemic. The public health crisis must not be used as an excuse to limit freedom of expression, speech, or assembly, or to criminalize defenders, journalists, political opponents, and others. Confronting the pandemic requires a joint effort based on human rights and democratic values. We remain committed to a globally coordinated, multilateral response to the pandemic. From the beginning, Germany has supported Act A and its COVAX facility to ensure everyone's fair and equitable access to safe, affordable, and effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. By contributing $2.2 billion, Germany is its second largest donor. Looking ahead, Germany is strongly committed to building structures for pandemic preparedness and response. Strengthening the WHO and international health regulations, including through periodic review mechanisms, must be at the core. We support the call for an international pandemic treaty. Madam High Commissioner, you highlighted that states should ensure that women and girls belonging to marginalized groups are provided with opportunities to participate meaningfully. Could you provide best practice examples? Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Senegal for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente, le Sénégal s'associe aux déclarations prononcées par ses groupes d'appartenance. La pandémie de Covid-19 et ses effets négatifs au plan socio-économique ont fini de relever la vulnérabilité collective des États et de démontrer la nécessité d'une approche fondée sur la solidarité et la coopération internationale pour y faire face. À la faveur de l'amélioration progressive des indicateurs de santé au niveau national, le Sénégal a au fur et à mesure levé les restrictions prises pour contrer la propagation de la pandémie et lancé sa campagne nationale de vaccination. Le Sénégal a aussi amélioré son plateau technique par la construction et l'équipement de nouveaux hôpitaux et a procédé à un recrutement important de personnel de santé. Par ailleurs, mon pays a élaboré un programme de relance économique et sociale dont l'objectif est d'atténuer les impacts socio-économiques de la pandémie. Afin de se préparer à la survenue de pandémies futures, mon pays prend une part active au processus d'élaboration d'une convention de l'OMS sur la préparation à la riposte aux pandémies. Pour conclure, ma délégation invite la communauté internationale à soutenir davantage les efforts de relance économique, surtout ceux des pays en développement, afin de ne pas ralentir la progression vers la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable, en particulier l'objectif 3. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Indonesia on Zoom.
President, let me begin by paying tribute to all healthcare workers in fighting the pandemic. With the risk faced, there also are human rights defenders. The current situation is still disheartening. Many countries are facing obstacles in getting the COVID-19 countermeasures and economic recovery, whereas some are gaining their economic recovery due to the rollout of vaccine distribution. High Commissioner observation before us is key. The maximum of the available resource, including through international cooperation, should be used. Our effort should be participatory and inclusive. We apply such principle into actions, such as, first, President Joko Widodo tirelessly reminds state apparatus on accountability and good governance when responding to pandemic. More so, state agencies such as Anti-Corruption Body and the Financial Supervisory and Development Board are monitoring the healthcare and National Economic Recovery Fund disbursement. Indonesia Human Rights Commission also monitors the SDGs performance during pandemic. Second, countries have some tendency to be insular in their response strategy when the contrary should be the solution. Therefore, our foreign minister's commitment in co-chairing the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment Engagement Group is to promote an inclusive and transparent process. Every country should be involved. Madam High Commissioner, could you elaborate more on how to enhance meaningful public participation in supporting global effort to control the pandemic? I thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Libya for a video statement.
رئيس أصحاب السعادة رؤساء الوفود الحضور الكرام، يسرني نيابة عن سعادة السفير تميم بعيد المندوب الدائم لدولة ليبيا المشاركة في أعمال الدورة 47 لمجلسكم الموقر، وأغتنم هذه المناسبة لأتقدم بالشكر للمفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان وبعثة الأمم المتحدة للدعم في ليبيا على جهودهما في دعم وتمهيد الطريق لتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار في بلادي. من على هذا المنبر نشيد بدعم مجلسكم الموقر طلب ليبيا تعيين لجنة
Can I ask the Secretariat again to pause this video, please? We're not getting interpretation. I understand there is a sound problem. I'm now going to give the floor to Australia for a video statement.
Australia believes that state responses to pandemics are most effective when individuals and communities have full access to their human rights. Our COVID-19 response has focused on a strong, science-led suppression strategy. Our inclusive health system ensures individuals in vulnerable situations, including older persons, people with disabilities, and our Indigenous communities, receive increased support.
The pandemic is not a problem confined to any one nation. Australia is helping with the urgent scale-up of vaccine access, delivery support and production across the world. We have committed at least 20 million COVID-19 vaccine doses as part of the G7 commitment to provide 1 billion doses by middle of next year. $130 million to the COVAX Facilities AMC, $523 million under our Regional Vaccine Access and Health Security Initiative, and $100 million for the Quad Vaccine Partnership, with our focus on last-mile delivery in Southeast Asia. Vaccines are just one part of global recovery. We reiterate our concerns that some states are taking advantage of COVID-19 to undermine or supplant established human rights. Governments must ensure response measures comply with international human rights obligations. We welcome the High Commissioner's recommendation that preparedness, response and recovery plans should be gender sensitive. How can national human rights institutions support states ensure a gender responsive recovery?
Thank you. And we will now give the floor to Ecuador. Ecuador, you have the floor on Zoom.
Gracias, señora presidenta. El Ecuador, a través del informe presentado, acoge sus recomendaciones y coincide la necesidad de integrar enfoques basados en derechos humanos a los esfuerzos de preparación, respuesta y recuperación ante emergencias sanitarias. Preocupa a mi delegación el desproporcionado impacto de la pandemia en las mujeres, reflejado entre otros en el incremento de trabajo no remunerado, en la precariedad laboral y en el aumento de la violencia de género. Consideramos fundamental que la comunidad internacional refuerce la cooperación y la solidaridad, en particular para atender las necesidades de las personas y los grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad como prioridad a escala mundial para todos los estados. La distribución y el acceso a las vacunas para el COVID-19 debe ser justo, transparente, equitativo, eficiente, universal y oportuno, así como a las tecnologías, insumos y productos esenciales para combatir la pandemia. Igualmente, las vacunas para el COVID y otras pandemias en el futuro deben ser consideradas como un bien público mundial en el ámbito de la salud para prevenir y contener y detener la transmisión y poner fin a la pandemia. El Ecuador ha redoblado esfuerzos en su respuesta sanitaria con el plan de vacunación 9-100, que aspira a vacunar 9 millones de ecuatorianos en los primeros 100 días del gobierno, lo que equivale a más del 50% de la población de mi país. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Fiji for a video statement.
Thank you, President. Fiji extends its appreciation to the High Commissioner for her report. The central role of states in responding to the pandemic cannot be understated. The pandemic has further brought to light the importance of international solidarity in addressing global problems. The pandemic is felt by all states, and some are better equipped than others to respond. In this regard, the High Commissioner's report on affirming commitments to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is welcomed and appreciated. Leave no one behind must guide decisions at the national level and resonates equally at an international level. In the same spirit that this Council pursues the realization of universal human rights, it should likewise pursue solidarity between states in responding to the pandemic. The equitable distribution of vaccines is essential if we are to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to Bangladesh for a video statement.
We thank Madam High Commissioner for her report. COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged our societies at an unprecedented level. On top of severe impacts on public health, the pandemic has hit hard the socio-economic development, particularly of the developing countries. If nothing else, the pandemic has exposed the implications of inequalities within and among states for human lives and societies. We are woefully prepared for tackling a catastrophe like the ongoing pandemic. Timely and adequate international support for the promotion and protection of economic, social, and cultural rights would have averted colossal human sufferings and economic losses. We cannot agree more with the Madam High Commissioner that the realization of the ODA commitments by the developed countries is crucial for a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the pandemic. We reiterate that a human right-based approach towards COVID-19 vaccination must be adopted to ensure timely and equal access to vaccines by all people in all countries. Migrants are disproportionately affected by the pandemic with loss of jobs, forced return, stigmatization, and discriminatory access to vaccines. We call upon the office to play an active role to ensure migrants' equal right to vaccine regardless of their status. Thank you.
Thank you. And I advise delegations whose videos could not be played that we are still working on the problem and we will play your videos in due course. I now give the floor to Montenegro for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. As the report's findings verify, the COVID-19 pandemic has repeatedly shown that human rights gaps act as a catalyst and multiplier not only for health, but also for political, security, and socio-economic crises. It is therefore imperative to integrate human rights-based approaches into efforts to strengthen health emergency preparedness, response recovery, and the resilience of our societies. This paradigm should be mindset and a driver of action. To achieve this, the chronic deficit in respect for protection and fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights should be effectively addressed. It also means upholding civil and political rights, since they are all inseparable, interconnected, and interdependent. To avoid backslides of any kind and to build back better, Montenegro will, inter alia, continue to join its voice in calling for equal global access to COVID-19 drugs, vaccines, therapies, and health technologies. To mitigate the COVID-19 socio-economic impacts, the government of Montenegro has implemented a few packages of measures to support citizens, MSMEs, and employment. The government also adopted a national strategy for the introduction, distribution, and application of COVID-19 vaccine, accompanied by its plan of action. In parallel, sufficient doses of vaccines are provided and mass vaccination continues at a satisfactory pace. Presently, we have 359 infected in the entire states. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Costa Rica on Zoom.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Costa Rica agradece el análisis, conclusiones y recomendaciones del informe de la alta comisionada para hacer frente a las desigualdades en el disfrute de los derechos humanos en tiempos de pandemia y otras emergencias sanitarias. Reconocemos la importancia de la protección y promoción de los derechos humanos, en particular los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales, y su indiscutible deterioro a raíz de las medidas sanitarias tomadas para combatir el COVID-19. Las situaciones expuestas en el informe son un alarmante reflejo de la realidad. Por ello, las medidas para atender a las poblaciones excluidas deben tomarse con la mayor urgencia y responsabilidad, centrando las discusiones en garantizar la protección social universal adecuada y sostenible para todas las personas, especialmente las niñas y las mujeres y quienes pertenecen a grupos marginados, incluidas las personas con discapacidad y las personas mayores. Debemos avanzar políticas públicas inclusivas con un enfoque basado en los derechos que atiendan las desigualdades derivadas del efecto de la pandemia, basadas en el acceso equitativo, la igualdad y la no discriminación. Mi país ha realizado importantes esfuerzos para promover el acceso mundial equitativo a diagnósticos, medicamentos, vacunas, tratamientos y tecnologías contra el COVID, mediante la plataforma mancomunada para compartir voluntariamente conocimientos, propiedad intelectual y datos, plataforma conocida como el CETAP. Agradecemos a la alta comisionada el apoyo a esta iniciativa multilateral que cuenta con el auspicio de la OMS. Adicionalmente, hemos hecho énfasis en la importancia de contar con mecanismos para el acceso al crédito que sean eficaces ante el impacto de la pandemia sobre la economía y sobre las personas. Para finalizar, quisiera reforzar el llamado para que todos los planes para la preparación y respuesta y recuperación se basen en los instrumentos internacionales de derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, and I give the floor to UNICEF. You have the floor. I understand they are not in the room. I now give the floor to China on Zoom.
主席女士、高专女士，面对突如其来的疫情，中国政府坚持人民至上、生命至上，采取最全面、最严格、最彻底的防控措施，疫情防控取得重大战略成果。中国积极参与国际抗疫合作，向150多个国家提供抗疫物资， 向国际社会提供超过3.5亿剂疫苗。中方愿同国际社会共同努力，早日战胜疫情，推动构建人类卫生健康共同体。新冠肺炎疫情进一步暴露多边人权机制对经社文权利和发展权投入的严重不足。为实现疫情后更好的复苏，各方应加大对经社文权利和发展权的关注和投入，重视社会保障体系建设，加大对弱势群体的保护，消除不平等。各方应共同反对种族主义、种族歧视和污名化，坚决抵制将科学问题政治化、甩锅推责、散布政治病毒的行为。谢谢主席女士。
Thank you. And I understand that some delegations have difficulties hearing the sound. We're trying to fix it. Apologies from us. I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic on Zoom.
شكرا سيد الرئيس، ونشكر المفوض السامي على تقريرها. سيد النظام، لا تزال جائحة كوفيد-19 تلقي بظلالها على قدرة الكثير من البلدان النامية على احتواء معدلات انتشار الوباء والتعامل مع نتائجه السلبية الأبعد مدى. إن اضطرار الدول لاتخاذ تدابير تقشفية تضر بجهودها الإنمائية وتدفع بالكثير من مواطنيها للوقوع ضحايا الفقر وعدم المساواة الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، يضع هذه الدول والمجتمعات لا سيما تلك التي تمر بأوضاع استثنائية أمام تهديدات جدية غير مسبوقة، ويؤكد الحاجة لتضامن وتعاون دولي حقيقي. وفي هذا الإطار تجدد سوريا مطالبتها بالرفع الفوري للتدابير القسرية الأحادية التي تستمر في الحد من قدرة الدول المستهدفة على التعامل بفعالية مع معدلات الإصابة بالفيروس، وتعيق استمرار الخدمات الصحية الأساسية لمواطنيها نتيجة القيود المفروضة على القطاعات الحيوية بما فيها القطاع الصحي، وتعرقل الأنشطة الإنمائية وعمل الوكالات الإنسانية فيها. وفي ظل التفاوت الراهن بين البلدان الغنية والفقيرة في توفير اللقاح الذي يعد الأداة الرئيسية للتغلب على الجائحة، فإن الدعوات من أجل التوزيع المنصف وغير التمييزي للقاحات واعتبارها سلعة عالمية عامة تكتسب أهمية متزايدة في هذا السياق. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to Brazil on Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. Brazil thanks for the report on the state response to pandemics. Its recommendations are generally consistent with our policies for universal health promotion, protection, and recovery, while protecting the lives, livelihoods, and rights of our population, including minorities and people in vulnerable situations, such as persons of African descent and traditional groups. Since the pandemic began, Brazil has provided emergency aid to protect the most vulnerable, especially the poor and informal workers, benefiting 68 million people. Formal workers were able to enroll in a mechanism that saved 10 million jobs. We also promoted food security for traditional peoples and communities during social distancing. Brazil offers universal free of charge vaccines against COVID-19 to all our inhabitants, including non-residents, migrants, and refugees without discrimination. Over 61 million people have received at least the first dose, with priority to indigenous and quilombolas. Madam High Commissioner, we welcome your recommendation for developed countries to redouble efforts to allocate 0.7% of their GNI for official development assistance. What concrete steps by developed countries would you recommend, Madam High Commissioner, as priority measures, including to promote vaccine equity. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished